Okay, recording. Well, hello, people out there in webinar land. This is Howard Mandel, president of the Jazz Journalists Association, and you've arrived at the third JJ training webinar, which tonight is on writing jazz biographies. This is just one of the programs that the JJ produces in our mission to format more and better jazz media of every type, about every kind of jazz everywhere. And although this webinar is free, we urge the participants consider joining the JJA. You can do that by going to jjanews.org and clicking join and following the simple instructions. I think you'll be glad you did that, and we certainly will be glad to have you as members. Other things, we have a hashtag for this webinar. It is hashtag, that is the number sign, JJA webinar. So tweet about us live or after the webinar is over. It'll be about 90 minutes. And search other people's tweets to see what people have to say about this. That is hashtag JJA webinar. One word. So we have 3 biographers on our panel tonight, although at the moment only 2 of them are online. Paul DeBarros is having a little problem he's trying to work out. He is in Seattle. He's the author of the not quite yet released book, Shall We Play That One Together? The Life and Art of Jazz Piano Legend Marion McPartland. And then we have Robin D.G. Kelly, who's author of Thelonious Monk, The Life and Times of an American Original. And Peter Pullman, author of Whale, The Life of Bud Powell. Robin's book, by the way, won the JJ's Jazz Award for Book of the Year in 2010. And I want to mention before we start that the JJ has many biographers as members. Some of them have registered for tonight's webinar, in fact. That would include Doug Ramsey, who's written a great biography of Paul Desmond. Some of the others are Tad Hirschhorn, who won the JJ Jazz Award for Book of the Year this year for Norman Graham's The Man Who Used Jazz for Justice. We also have David Kasten, who wrote Nika's Dream, The Life and Legend of the Jazz Baroness. David Avenir, All the Things You Are, The Life of Tony Bennett. Stephanie Stein-Kreis, who's written about Gil Evans. Bob Lubenthal, about Sonny Rollins. Gary Gibbons, of course, biographer of Bing Crosby, Louis Armstrong, Charlie Parker. David Haydu, biographer of Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Richard and Mimi Farina, and also Billy Strayhorn. John Edward Hasse, who's written a bio of Ellington. John Litweiler of Ornette Coleman. Bill Milkowski of Jaco Pastorius. Mark Miller of Herbie Nichols and Valadia Snow. John Zwed of Alan Lomax, Sun Ra, and Miles Davis. I hope I haven't left anyone out, but what I have left out is our members who co-authored as told to autobiographies, which I think are a rather different literary form than the biography that we're talking about tonight. And these biographies tonight are all long-form biographies. There are some basic similarities to profiles in magazines and program notes, or what musicians need for publicity and promotion purposes, but there's a lot more differences to doing a long-form book. And these are some of the topics we're going to take up tonight. We will ask for questions from the audience. You can type them into the chat box, which you will see on your GoToWebinar control panel. And I will convey those questions to the panelists as they seem pertinent during the discussion, or else I'll wait till about 2/3 of the way in, about an hour from now, and some of the questions will come up then. So while we're waiting for, I'm sorry that Paul DeBarros isn't here, and he's going to be on the phone with me if he's having a big problem. But to begin, let's call on Peter Pullman to talk about a question that he actually raised in our rehearsal yesterday. What approach did you determine to take prior to starting work on your biography? This is the question I'm going to put to Robin and Paul also. What were your concepts and precepts going into the task? Peter?
Thanks. I determined that, having worked with liner note writers for many years at Verve Records, that a biography must be something much greater than an extended liner note, or for that matter, a glorified discography. I used as a template, or really as a role model, biographies I'd read in other fields, in which the writer, it became clear to me in reading those books, over the course of time, had not just expanded his knowledge of his subject, but had come to embrace the contradictions, jazz writing, particularly liner notes, but also those who come out of the tradition of writing reviews of nightclub gigs and concerts, are generally in the business of promoting. They're in the business of writing enthusiastically, positively, and writing in such a way that makes the listener, or if he was there or not, root on the subject. It's all about presenting, well, often heroes. I mean, many of these artists are heroes to us. I said to myself, Bud Powell, I want to know as much as I can about him because I'm convinced that he had his vices as well as his virtues. Well, some of them are well known to any jazz fan out there. But I think that that holds for anyone who's going to set out to write a biography. You're not there to promote the subject, and you're not doing boosterism. You're not there to make him look good no matter what. I believe a serious biography over the course of years of research deepens your understanding to where you can accept the minuses as well as the pluses. And so you don't tarnish the image in writing a book that has paradoxes or a subject that whose paradoxes you reveal. You burnish the image. And that's what I was determined to do, not to write something that sounded like fandom or was, well, you thought that last session was great, fans, well, listen to this one. He was really great on this, and the guys are really cooking, and then they went on tour, and they just gelled, everything came together. I mean, obviously that happened. Bud Powell was a great musician. But there was so much that went on in his life that I wanted to know about so I could make a complex portrait. That's what my goal was.
Interesting. So, Robin, do you have a similarity in the way you approached Thelonious Monk, or did you have a different concept in mind?
So, well, a different experience, I should say. And I came to this project as a historian, not as a music writer per se, though I'd been reading jazz journalism from the beginning because, you know, this is the music I kind of grew up with. And what I wanted to know initially was, you know, what did Thelonious Monk mean as this kind of iconic figure, someone who is shrouded by myth and mystery. And part of that had to do with the fact that when I launched this project, at first the Monk family wasn't interested in me writing a book. They had some other things going on. And so for 5 years, I was beginning to write a very different kind of book, which is about sort of Monk the icon. And then as a result of some developments, they changed their mind and opened up doors to me, and it completely changed my concept, not just the concept of what kind of book I was wanting to write, but also what I thought about Monk. And it's not as if the family had a whole bunch of stuff. It wasn't like some huge archive someplace, but the small materials they did have available were very rich, and the connections to human beings who were connected to Monk gave me a new perspective. And so what started out as a kind of historical study of Monk the image became the story of Monk the man and his community in the world that helped create him and he created. And so that to me was far more rewarding, but also more eye-opening for me in terms of understanding who he is as a person, you know.
So both of you seem like you worked with images of these musicians that you started off with, but that deepened and changed over the period of your research. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah. Yes.
Howard, if I could say, of course, over the time you gain insight, you gain knowledge, you start to build. I built a template. I actually took his discography, and then in the interstices between record sessions, I inserted every clip I could find from whatever media, every event that I knew to have happened. I did all that. But what I wanted as a result was a work that when people read it, they would say, well, this is a great subject for a book. I mean, that's what you're trying to do when you write a book, is have the reader follow with you. And he doesn't have to agree with what you say, but as an example, I read a biography of Bakunin, the anarchist, and I kept saying to myself that with every instance, with every episode the writer included, oh, this is a great subject. Wow, he picked a great subject to write a book about. Well, that isn't the case. What happened is he had made his decisions about his subject over the course of years. He allowed himself to have his mind not just deep, his insights deepen, but his ideas changed. So eventually, everything he put in that book justified and reinforced what he felt. I think if you're writing seriously, we all know, every time you write a sentence, you should ask yourself, well, what's the point of that sentence? You write a paragraph, you write an episode. Is this saying what I wanted to say? Does this reinforce my view? And I think with a jazz biography, it's a steep climb because of most of the literature that is about how great these guys are and women. I think if you want to write a compelling book, you have to reach a depth of understanding where you can include everything. And then every time you have an episode, it's not just there because it's the next thing in the chronology. It's there so that the reader says, well, yeah, that's a subject, that fits his subject. This is a perfect book. I think it's a lot of it's internal.
Robin, are your writing processes similar to Peter's?
Well, it's hard to say. I know that I guess there are two issues. One is that in terms of the question that you raised about the image of Monk, I mean, one of the things that I had to contend with was people coming up to me and asking two questions. That is, what is the source of his genius and what is the source of his craziness? It came down to that. And so what I ended up having to do was really dislodge a lot of these representations of both madness and sort of a kind of genius that's sort of represented as childlike, and kind of an idiot savant kind of image of Monk, and really get to the hard questions of what part of his representation functions for the fans, for the music industry, and trying to sell him, and what part of his life is actually being hidden or shrouded behind this. And so in dislodging the tropes, I had to kind of put Monk's eccentricities into context, talk about his stagecraft, his expressions of humor, his act of resistance. And the last thing I wanted to do was paint a portrait of Monk as kind of like the standard working musician, because he wasn't just that. So in terms of my writing process, there were sort of three things I focused on. One, in looking at the small archive I had to fill it in with all kinds of materials from all over the globe. I did a lot of traveling. And I discovered that this is sort of, the Monk story is a love story. A love story in terms of his love of the music, his love of family, his romantic relationship with Nellie and his children, his love of his children. There's that. There's also a story of money, and every musician knows it. If you follow the money, you really have a story. And so much of what I had to do was get away from reading just liner notes and reading hagiographies and all these celebratory statements about Monk, and reading his tax returns and reading contracts and reading those documents that actually tell a very different story of how he survived. And it really shocked me, I have to say, how little money he made over the years. And so that helped me understand issues that we sometimes put in the abstract, like creative drive, creative choices, that these things were all put in context of, whether or not he would get paid and for what, and what are the costs of his output, So these are the kinds of things that I had to sort of figure out and then write the story in a narrative form that could engage the reader, and I try to do the best I could there.
Who did you
may I ask Robin the question?
Okay.
Robin, did you find that one of the salutary ways to dispel the myths and all that, and the mystery of Monk, was through his associations, his work associations? I found I had to deal with Powell's illness too, or perceived illness, and I found just by talking to the musicians who worked with him, I got a picture of a extremely serious individual who put music first no matter what.
Right.
And whatever illness, whatever was going on around him, that music was always first and foremost.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you talked to enough musicians who talked about how Monk worked in the studios, preparing for whatever, to give you the picture that, well, he obviously was a very intense, serious, and disciplined musician, whatever else he was.
Oh, sure. No question that his sidemen, work associates, people he played with told a very different story, and that's all documented in the book. But his family, I found, was even more valuable in terms of telling stories that are outside of the studio, outside of the club, that actually take place in his home. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that the locus of jazz studies really needs to shift, or at least expand, from those sites that we think of as very common, like the studio and the club and the stage, and get to the homes, to the neighborhoods, to the communities where so much of creative work takes place.
I agree 100%. The tragedy of the Bud Powell story is that he didn't have what Monk had. And he did not have a stable home life. There were years in which he probably spent more hours at Birdland than he did sleeping anywhere. He really didn't have a home. So I document that. I did everything I could to place him outside the club, but my narrative kept taking me back there because that's where he lived. I mean, he was at Birdland in 1953. I counted the hours. It was extraordinary, 28 weeks. And he was in the hospital for some of the year. So that's his home life, sad to say, which is why I think the Monk story is a much more uplifting one than the Powell story.
Well, I think that, Robin, you certainly were able to accomplish what you set out to do. I mean, from my reading of it, you've shown Monk to be a really quite a suave character early in his life anyway. Well-dressed and very much on top of it. And when he dropped out of high school, he knew what he was doing because he was making money playing and stuff like that. And I think this is not to question, not to draw a distinction between your writing styles or anything like that, but rather the characters who you're writing about here. Because Peter, I mean, Bud was like, became completely opaque to me. And although I think you made valiant strides to exhibit what his whole life was about, he himself just seemed so resistant to penetration. It's quite sad.
If I can characterize in one sentence what 90% of the people who I interviewed said, it was, he never talked. If I could give you a second sentence, it was, what the do you want me to say? And I persisted, and they said, he never talked. So what I was able to extract, or what I was able to tease out of that, was that he put up a wall in part because he had accepted this idea of genius, and Robin touched on it. And I think that from the earliest age, Powell did have parents, and they were determined that he would get them into another social class with his talent. So he was told from the age of 5 that he was a genius. And I think that he used that as a badge of honor, as a protective shield, and ultimately to keep people out. So the only people he ever talked to were the few musicians whom he thought were talented enough. He said, whenever he opened his mouth, he said, why should I talk to so-and-so? He wouldn't know what I'm talking about. Just to tie this in with Robin, of course, the man he admired more than anyone else on earth was Thelonious Monk. I believe Thelonious Monk was the love of Bud Powell's life because he said in the few comments he ever made, Thelonious gets it. Thelonious knows what I'm talking about. That I'm paraphrasing. He didn't really say, he didn't speak that, he wasn't that prolix. But that's what Powell was to the world, opaque, except for a small number. Elmo Hope was another musician whom he could talk to because he thought Hope was on his level.
Well, and there are other people that you both interview, for instance, Jackie McLean, who, is somebody who was at least admiring of Bud and around him, as well as
Yeah.
mentored by Monk. I think it's great that we have the two of you, whose work, whose characters overlapped and had this relationship. And it brings me to the question that I think is very hands-on, and for any people in the audience who have ambitions to write a biography, what kind of commitments did you know you were making to research when you started out? What did you anticipate this endeavor would involve? How long a period of time? Did you budget for it? Did you set yourself deadlines? Did you know where you were going to have to go and who you were going to have to talk to? Or did that unfold during the process?
I
Let Robin go
know
first.
that sorry, you want to go, Robin?
Oh, yeah, sure, I'll jump in. It's a question that always makes my hair stand on the end. I thought I could finish this book in about 5 years. Now, I should add two things. I began a different book, and I actually had a manuscript which I tore up, which was based on this other idea. Once I was able to have access to the family. And when that began, from that point on, it took about 12 years altogether, maybe a little longer. And it required an enormous expense. I think my first marriage dissolved as a result of this book, but I haven't figured that out yet. Because of the cost. I must have come out of pocket about $75,000 over the years.
Whoa!
In terms of travel, connections, and I made a choice, in many cases, to help out musicians who needed help, financially, because I think people give me time. I want to give them back. I didn't do that for everyone, but for certain people. And so I was really embedded in a kind of community and a culture, and also the fact that there's no central archive meant that I was all over the United States, in Europe, and even finding stuff in Japan. So, it took much longer, and I vowed when I was done with this that I would never, ever write another biography.
Hey, Howard, I'm here now. I hear that, Robin.
Hey, Paul, great to hear you. Paul DeBarros.
I'm not on my laptop, but I'm on my phone.
Okay.
Okay, well, this will work. I'm glad you're here. We've been talking about, to begin with, let me just get you to catch up. What basic assumptions, premises, precepts did you go into writing your biography about Marion McPartland? What was your initial approach?
Well, it was sort of dictated in a certain way by this enormous archive that she'd collected herself. Marion, of all the musicians I've ever met in my life, is the only one who really collected her own stuff. I mean, all of you probably are familiar with musicians who don't have copies of their own records.
Right.
Marion not only had copies of every record she ever made, she had every review that had ever been written about her in every paper in the world.
Yeah, so how can you dip into that? Wasn't
Well,
that...
it was at her house, and she said, "Come on over."
Wow.
This
So
is
I
the big...
Come on, at her house.
This is the big difference between your work and that Peter and Robin have done, that you had a living person that you had to deal with here, or got to deal with. And I don't know if that was a challenge or an opportunity or both. How do you see that?
Oh, very much both. I mean, Marion's a pretty crusty character, and she did not give it up very easily. She was very suspicious. She's not a trusting person by nature. She probably didn't get where she is by being trusting. And so it was really, really difficult to convince her that it was going to be all right, and in many ways I sympathize with her, to have her story told by somebody else. She was very much used to being in control of her own story. On the other hand, it was kind of ambivalent because she said, "Come on over and you can just look at anything." And that anything didn't just include reviews in the Cleveland newspaper. It included her journals. It included letters. It included attempts at writing an autobiography or an as told to biography with 6 other writers in the past. So there were thousands of pages of transcripts of interviews that went all the way back to the 1970s that she opened up to me. So it was this constant kind of seesaw between her being extremely open and then at the same time saying, but you're not going to put that in the book, are you?
Howard?
Yeah,
Howard?
Peter.
I think what you're getting from the three of us, and you led in with, what were the expectations, the precepts, what was your approach, is just how much adjustments we had to make given our situations. And I think it's instructive that Paul had such a huge archive and the person available. Robin didn't have either of that, but he had the family. And my case was so different because I had none of either. So I had to make a different kind of adjustment. I think we all went where our research took us. It's just, if you don't have it, you pursue it. And I'm sure all three of us went to all lengths to try to get things. In my case, because of the opacity, as you call it, the opaqueness of my subject, I started to write a biography of the people in his life. I found if I couldn't get any quotes from him, and he left no paper trail at all, he never was interviewed. I mean, it's incredible. There are virtually no quotes from him anywhere. So I looked to the people who were in his life, however briefly, and they were like spokes on a wheel. Each one was another way toward the hub of Bud Powell. And I was able to make a story that's really the story of all these other people and their attempts to help him, or their attempts to learn from him, their attempts to get close so they could play with him, and unfortunately in many cases, their attempts to get close so they could exploit him. But as I say, each of us found a different route, and we couldn't have known when we started which route it was going to be.
I like your comparison, Peter, because, I faced just the opposite problem. I had this story that had already been told with information in my subject's house, and so I had to go out into the world to find other people and other sources to balance the story that I was getting from her and from her archive. So it was just the opposite. I could have just said, oh yeah, here's the story right here in the basement, but I couldn't be satisfied with that. I had to go out and triangulate.
I'm sorry, I'm having a little problem at the moment with questions, and I want to tell the attendees that I'm not seeing your questions showing up if you're typing them in. So I'm going to ask you, if you want to send a question, let's try to send it to my email, which is president@jazzjournalists.org, and I'll try to keep an eye on that too. So I'm sorry, guys. I don't think that we came up with, well, how long did this take? I mean, Robin, you said you thought you were going to be able to deal with the book in 5 years,
Yeah,
but
it took about 12.
I gather it went considerably long.
Mm-hmm. It took altogether.
12.
I took about 12. It took, I say 12, but really it's 14. But then I got hit by a car, and for 2 years I couldn't do anything. In fact, leaving the Institute for Jazz Studies.
Oh my!
That's another story. It's a very funny story, but I survived it, and it took a very long time. And in part, I should add one other thing to this, to understanding the context. I made a very conscious decision not to write an authorized biography, meaning I did not want the approval from anyone in the family, because I wanted to be able to write what I felt was the truth. And that also slowed down things because, it required, filling in stories, talking to other people, finding other sources, but also what my book tries to do is tell not just Monk's story, but the story of America and the sort of mid-century world, if you will, through Monk's life, work, and travels. And so it meant looking at other sources in other languages, having works translated from Portuguese, French, Spanish, German, Dutch, Czech, Japanese to basically understand what monk meant to the world. So I tried to make to tell a much bigger story than Monk's personal experiences.
Well, I have to ask you, Robin, I hope you'll be candid to the extent that you feel comfortable here, but how was this funded?
Oh, well, I mean, I'm very, very fortunate in that I'm a professor at the university. I have research funds that funded much of it. I had an advance from the Free Press, and then some of it just came out of pocket. I mean, I'm like I said, I'm blessed. I make a decent salary, and and for me, it was all worth it. I'll never get the money back, but the value of doing this work, this is my life's work. I mean, I can't think of ever writing a book that would have this much meaning to me than the book on Monk.
Robin, I'm glad you brought up that dread phrase "authorized" too, because the public understands that word, misunderstands that word as meaning, oh, this is the truth.
Right.
But in fact, an authorized biography means that you sign an agreement with your subject saying that they have the final cut. And that was something that I didn't do. In fact, I drew up an agreement with Marion saying, I have the final cut. You can read everything I write and correct facts if you want, but if there's something in this book you don't like, too bad.
Mm-hmm.
Peter, did you have to negotiate that difficulty also with some of your interviewees?
Did I have to, I'm sorry, did I have to do what?
Negotiate that...
Money? Never.
No, not money.
Never gave any, no, never gave anybody a dime.
No, but agreement about what you would talk, publish.
Oh, no, never did. I treated this project from the very beginning as, to use what Robin said, as the book of my life. I didn't, within a few years I recognized it was going to take a long, long time. I frustrated many people who expected it to be out sooner. And I just said, I don't care if it takes the rest of my life. I want to do the best job I can. And again, something Robin said that really resonates, to give the reader some sense of what the world thought of Bud Powell's music. Not what they thought of him personally, because, as I say, he didn't give off any of that. But I did want to, and I went all halfway around the world as well, to try to get a sense, what did he mean to the German people? What, he lived in France, what did he mean there? And I told myself, if it took all of my life, so be it. I borrowed money recklessly. I felt like a musician. I borrowed money from everybody. I slept on people's couches. I'll never be able to pay the money back, but I feel similarly that I don't care. I know how Powell devoted his whole life to his music and how nothing else mattered. And while I tried not to be rude, I tried to be as determined. And if that meant taking 12 years, which it did, and leaving two commercial publishers, or one commercial and one university publisher, and I left them both, and I did it myself, my way, well, that was the price I paid. But as I say, what I owe, I can't pay back, and I just hope that people who gave me money, some people gave me as much as $10,000 or $15,000, I hope that they do read it. They're not jazz people, and that they say, well, you know, he gave it his all, just as his subject did, and I don't regret it for a minute either.
Have you, like Robin, sworn off writing another bio?
No, I wouldn't say that. I guess reading this Bakunin biography was just so inspiring and brought back memories of what it's like to discover a subject. I am working on a book on 3 filmmakers, and it will be part biographical. So, well, I guess it's a yes and a no. Devote my entire life to pursuing one person down every dark alley and every dead end. No, I think I'd like to do something more of a comparative biography of 3 artists. But the biographical challenge is, I think it's in my blood now. And I know so much more about methods. In fact, you asked about interviewing. I think I developed a pretty good instinct for what I can ask, what I can't ask, and frankly, when I think I'm being told bullshit. I think Frederick Wiseman, the filmmaker, once said he had a built-in bullshit meter. And I think when you interview, you got to have that. And I think I developed it over time.
I'm getting a question from outside about primary sources. This questioner says, I'm currently reviewing Richard Vacca's The Boston Jazz Chronicles, the first serious history of jazz in Boston. He talks about the difficulties of accessing published sources beyond, quote, newspaper of records on microfilm and clipping files and personal collections of memorabilia. Can you discuss the challenges of getting access, and has access improved over time? I guess, yeah, anybody wants to field that.
I could talk about the access to particular sources. Like I've been, for example, you know, the local 802, at least for musicians who are working in New York, those records are really rich, and I found some eye-opening stories about Monk's participation as an active union member defending his own interests through that. And then the other thing that happened was just as I was sort of on the sort of middle and last legs of this book, two wonderful archives opened up. Tio Macero, who is producer at Columbia Records and a musician, he left his papers in New York Public Library, which, you know, he had things I don't think he should have had from Columbia Records, which were just mind-boggling, you know, and it's just a really rich source for anyone working on artists at Columbia. And then finally, the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University, Eugene Smith's papers and recordings that opened up there. I mean, I can't even tell you how rich that source was, because these were homemade recordings of rehearsals, at least in the case of Monk, for the big band and jam sessions and that sort of thing. And many people probably know Sam Stevenson, who's put out a book on the Loft history and the recordings, because he was basically the caretaker for this material. These are the kinds of sources that really can change the way this history is written. And I think there are other sources, which I can't get into right now, but these are three examples of really rich sources, primary sources.
Well, you also went back to Monk's grandparents and did that historical research, it seemed like, to retrieve information about his entire parental legacy. And that must have involved something further.
Yeah, it meant basically spending a lot of time in North Carolina at the State Archives and hunting down. But there's one small story which I thought was kind of astounding. Like, if people read the book, they'll know that the first chapter opens up with the story of Julius Monk and Thelonious Monk and their relation. And so it just so happens that the musician, performer, Julius Monk had done a family tree. And of course, in this family tree are the unnamed slaves that are connected to Thelonious. And so I just found it ironic that another New York musician helped me in the process of really uncovering this early history, which to me is important because it tells not just the story of Monk, but the story of the kind of political and cultural legacy that really shaped his parents' world and the world and his own world.
That was a lovely opening to the book, I thought. That was really rich.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, really good. Now, Peter, you kind of like go right into the thicket of it, it seems to me. Some of the liveliest writing and descriptions and vivid things that I didn't know about at all were when you had Powell and the whole bebop cohort on 52nd Street, and the idea of these guys, you know, diving in and out of each other's clubs, sitting in here, and this night they're over there in this configuration. It was very lively, and I don't know, did that just come from AFM resources, or?
Well, there are some pretty standard social histories of the era. My colleagues all know what they are, but hear me talking to you, which is frustrating because none of the quotes are attributed other than who said it, but you have no idea when, where, or where first appeared in print. But Arnold Shaw's books on 52nd Street, The Street That Never Slept, I mean, there are social histories, and while people like Shaw or Shapiro and Hentoff, who did Hear Me Talking to You, well, they're unreliable on dates. They really are. And when you do discography, you start to see, well, how could they say that? It couldn't possibly have happened at such a place. What they are very good at is the social. And what they convey is the importance of the live performances. Now, that may sound obvious, but if you put your head in discography long enough, and if you're a jazz record collector, as most of us are, and you talk to other people who say, yeah, I really did that Bud Powell record from Blue Note or whatever, you lose sight of the fact that these guys appeared in the clubs at least 10 hours, maybe 20 hours for every hour they spent in the studio. They lived in the clubs. Powell maybe more than others, but still. I mean, Monk was different altogether. He's the exception to every rule. But most guys work in order to eat, and so they play in the club. So they always, talk about how terrible the conditions were. So when you recognize how much of life passes in the clubs, you begin to sense what or how to write that history as social history. And I appreciate the comment because I really endeavored to give as much space in the book to the live interactions on the bandstand and backstage. Bill Crow's book on Birdland, From Broadway to Birdland, no, Birdland to Broadway, whatever it is great for his description of what the backstage area at Birdland was like. In a word, seedy. But if he describes what the toilet looked like, and you recognize that since there were 3 bands that played at Birdland nightly, your guy, in my case Bud Powell, spent a lot of time back there. And he was bumping into Sarah Vaughan, and he was bumping into whoever the other acts that were on. So I felt that I wanted my narrative to live in those moments, much more so than the record dates. One, because you can listen to the record, and, you make up your own mind which tune you like best. I did some narrative there, but it was much more about the life in the clubs. And that, I believe, for a guy like Powell was essential and was the only way, really, that I could get at who he was, by whom he was interacting with, whom he played with the most, whom he played with the best, all that sort of stuff.
Paul, did you approach things that way also? Did you think of...
I definitely did. I mean, I'm definitely interested in the same kind of thing Peter's talking about, and Robin as well. I mean, what did it feel like?
Switch to my screen.
Pardon me?
Yeah, Joanne, change to Peter's screen, please. I'm sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Oh, yeah, I was just saying that I definitely concur with that approach. I like the idea of giving readers a feeling of what it actually felt like to be out there doing it, and who was going to be around, and what were the social norms that would have influenced people's behavior, and what were they thinking about, what were they reading. I mean, I spent a lot of time reading the things that Marion told me she had read, books that were influential on her, to get an idea of, what she might have been thinking about various social things that were going on, particularly feminism, but other things as well. But to get to the questioner comment, or the commenter's question, there are 2 things that I think are real challenges at getting to primary sources. One is money. I mean, Ancestry.com charges money. You can't just find people's ancestry. You have to find somebody that has a subscription to it, or a library that does. So I had a huge challenge when I was in England trying to sort out Marion's early family life, her relatives going back 3 or 4 generations, because she had sort of a standard story she told people, but she didn't actually know who any of these people really were. So luckily I found a librarian in Slough, which is where she was born, near Windsor, who helped me out and just went to the website and found a bunch of stuff for me. That was like a gold mine. The other thing that I think you're constantly doing, and I'm sure Peter and Robin experience this all the time, is you're always looking for that source, that primary source, that letter, that journal, that unauthorized or unpublished biography or sketch, or records from the unions, or records from the record companies, logs from the you're always looking for those things, and whenever you're talking to people, you just have to be on the lookout for them. I found in one of Marion's file drawers an unpublished 110-page biography of Jimmy McPartland that nobody but Marion and me has ever seen. It was like a gift from the gods.
How did you actually organize your materials as you were discovering stuff? All three of you. Do you keep card files? Is this all done on your computers? I mean, are you trying to do this chronologically, or are you just taking information and then fitting it into your own timeline?
Well, I said that I that I took his discography as fixed dates. Some of them were off a little bit, but there was a discographer. As like Paul said, you know, you find these people out there. This music is all over the world, and there are fanatics everywhere. And I found in Marseille a discographer, and he'd done a pretty good job with Powell. So I had those as fixed dates, and I had somebody put it into a file. I'm not very good with computer. And then I put spaces in between each fixed date. And that's when I put in the interstices every fact that I could determine with a date. And I will just say parenthetically that the most important for me was Powell's lawyer. And we all have our opinions of lawyers, but since we're looking for where the money went and we're looking for the paper trail, in my case, I first went to the courts, and unfortunately Powell was involved in a number of cases. But those courts gave me also fixed dates because people are under oath. If they say something happened on a date, it's pretty good. Or if the police submit a report, you know, the dates are probably pretty good. And they also gave me the names of lawyers. So from the court cases, and by the way, I photocopied everything. That's the short answer to Howard. I photocopied everything, and if it had a date, I put it in a file in chronological order. I then had the names of lawyers, and I contacted them, and eventually got to the other hero of my book. There are two heroes. Thelonious Monk is one, and the second hero is Maxwell Cohen, a name that should be better known than it is, but he's the man who eventually got the so-called cabaret card thrown out. The law was never a law, but the practice was discontinued, and musicians could work in a club even if they had a prior conviction. It's a New York thing. If you're not from New York, you might not even know about it. Anyway, Cohn was the lawyer, and he had a huge paper file, and I photocopied everything he had.
I use a sort of unorthodox approach in the archive when I would be working at Marion's house. A lot of people ask me, why don't you just scan everything, or why don't you photocopy things? And my experience of scanning and photocopying, unless you need to refer to the document, again, as a factoid in itself, was that if I don't take notes on something, I forget it. So I just took chronological notes. I created these enormous chronological files and stuck everything in if it had a date or it was close to a date that worked. If it was by subject, I created subject files if it didn't fit with a date. And I just took notes, and in some cases I typed verbatim what I found rather than photocopy it, because I just didn't want a pile of paper to have it all in my laptop.
Yeah.
Were you worried about accidentally plagiarizing, or something like that in that piece?
No, because I sourced everything.
Okay. Were there specific, you mentioned feminism before in relation to Marion, and were there gender issues? Because jazz is such a male-dominated genre, and here this was an instrumentalist, which is also unusual for women participating. Did anything like that?
There were huge gender issues. I mean, she's played them down because she doesn't really like to think that way, and she'd really like to present herself as an individual who triumphed over other obstacles. But no, I mean, she ran into situations. There's a lot of that in my book about her. I mean, where Barbara Carroll, for example, who really was the premier female bebop player in New York when Marion got there, Barbara had to disguise herself as Bobby Carroll just to get gigs.
But I was really meaning, were there gender issues in winning over her trust and getting the agreements, her feeling that somebody, going to write her biography, nobody could do it better than her, that sort of thing?
I think she felt nobody could, she thought nobody could do it better than she could for years until she realized she was never going to do it. Right. At that point, I don't think it was an issue that I was male. I think she was just looking for somebody that she could trust. And eventually, you'd have to ask her, but I think eventually she trusted me because she told me what I wanted to know.
Did you have to sign a contract with her?
I wrote.
Was there attorney involvement?
Pardon me?
Was there attorney involvement?
Her attorney read it, but I just wrote up a one-page agreement. I wouldn't even call it a contract, saying what our procedure would be, and again, who had the final say over what went in the book. But there wasn't any real legal language like, you know, I'm preventing you from suing me, et cetera, et cetera.
And I gather she did not expect any compensation or share of the royalties.
No, we talked about that too. I said, this is my book. I'm going to pay for it. I had the other problem with her. She wanted to pay for it. You know, she wanted to hire somebody. That's what she had done in the past. She had hired people to write her story, and then for one reason or another, they would disagree, and the book would never get done. So I didn't want to write that kind of book. I didn't want to be. I wasn't a writer for hire. I said, I'm going to write a third-person objective, or as objective as it can be, narrative, and you're the subject, and I'm the writer, and I get paid for it, and you're the subject. That's pretty much the beginning and the end of it. She offered to pay for a lot of things, and I kept having to tell her no. I mean, Marion's pretty well off, and she uses car service for everything. She lives out on Long Island, and when I went out to see Joe Morello, may he rest in peace, he was out in East Orange, and she said, oh, I'll send you out there in car service. And, I just felt for my own integrity I had to take the bus.
All right. Right on, Paul.
Did any of the three of you have problems with other people's estates wanting to interfere with some depiction of some of the side characters, not your main subjects? For instance, I know Miles Davis's estate sometimes interferes with or wants to influence his depiction.
In my case, I didn't have an estate trying to influence the depiction of any other musician, but there were two issues that came up. One is that there's another. In fact, I'm assuming David Kasten's actually on this in this webinar, and he knows the story. But Nika de Cornelswater had this whole cache of recordings, huge number of homemade recordings, some of which migrated into the Monk family possession, but most of them were hers. And they're not accessible, and the person who controls those recordings is Barry Harris. And Barry definitely didn't want anyone to have access to them. At some point, they were going to be released as a series of recordings, but then I think they were pulled back. So that's one of the few things I didn't get access to, which I don't think will change the story, but it's another really rich body of material that could be very, very valuable. I mean, I have a listing of the recordings, and some of them are actually conversations. There's that. And the other thing that happened was when the Monk estate had put out some of the homemade recordings under Thelonious Records, a few of the musicians, and Frankie Dunlop was one, had sued because they weren't being paid. There was no agreement for them to be paid since they were on the date of these homemade recordings. And so a lot of that stuff ended up being held up or withdrawn. I'm not sure what the outcome is, but again, the thing about writing this kind of these kinds of stories and write about musicians where money is involved, people are affected by it, always.
What about family members? Did they have concerns too amongst them? Squabbling family members, was that problematic at all?
In my case, in Monk's case, there were differences, definitely. But those differences were, I just had to negotiate those differences. Differences in terms of how people remember stories, differences in terms of who did what for whom. And that goes with the territory. However, on all sides of Monk family, the Smith side, the Monk side, all the other family members, the extended family, people really had an investment in making sure a truthful story was told. I mean, not everyone, it's not a flattering story always for everyone. And no one really struggled with me over, well, I mean, if anything, I got more complaints about the stories that didn't make the book, that was sort of on the cutting room floor. Those are the complaints I got.
What kind of thought? Yeah.
I thought I'd weigh in on this issue about people who might have blocked or might have been a hindrance. My story had to involve sooner or later Francis Podras, the Frenchman who was the subject, as much as he was the object, of Around Midnight, whatever jazz fans think about that movie. It would not have happened had Podras not given his memoir to Bertrand Tavernier to make the film. Podras was alive when I started the project, and I made it my business to go to see him. And I don't know if you two writers had this experience where somebody thought he was or she was the keeper of the secrets or the keeper of some of the flame, and who you anticipated friction or perhaps being told to butt out, that this other person had the rights to the information, the anecdotes, or even documentation. I found that just being persistent and just being polite but firm, Podras gave way. He had amassed a lot of stuff, memorabilia, documents, private recordings. He often, when got Powell drunk, when he wasn't trying to keep him sober, I mean, very strange relationship, he tried to help Powell to stop drinking, but at other times he allowed Powell to get drunk, turned on the tape recorder, and then had him play. And I guess Podras was thinking about posterity. He did a lot of other things too, and so he had something, he called it an archive, a Bud Powell archive in France. And I found, just by visiting him as I did, and since I speak French, conducting as much of the transactions as I could in French, and having a lot of French people on my side, people who saw that I was serious, sincere, people I had talked to in Paris who phoned him. He lived in the countryside. So when I got to him, and then I went back a second time, even more so, I got somebody who realized I wasn't going to back down, I was firm, and that I was serious. And he wound up giving me anything and everything I wanted. He then killed himself. I don't think that was cause and effect. However, he did take his life, and I dealt with his son. And I thought I might have problems with him, and not at all. He wound up giving Institute of Jazz Studies Podras' film collection, which included interviews with Kenny Clark, on-camera interviews with Kenny Clark and others who were living in Europe. Otherwise, we wouldn't have that material at all. So I found just stay on it. And over years and years, you wear people down or they die, I guess.
Again, I want to ask how you're able to manage deadlines. How did you set up a structure for this has to be done by this point? Or was that all imposed by your publishers?
Well, in my case, it was very much enforced by the publisher. And I mean, I would have spent another year working on this book if I'd had my druthers. But I was dealing with a New York trade house that said, you know, give us the book or we're not going to do it. So it was a different kind of a situation than, for me, what would I think be more desirable, which would be in an academic setting where you can say, well, yeah, I'm not finished. You know, I'll do this. I'll finish this when I finish it. But I know I had money issues too. I mean, I had to finish it. I was out of money. I was borrowing money, so it made sense to finish it. But yeah, deadlines drive a lot of things.
Right. In my case, I missed my deadline about 7 times, and was reminded by my editor. I went to 2 editors actually, but reminded by the people at the Free Press that my book was the longest they waited for. Except for
Good for you.
But you know, they almost cut me off. The funny thing is, though, in terms of the question, is that once I had much of the working manuscript done, they rushed it into print and rushed it so quickly. I didn't have, I don't think I had adequate copy editing. I had like 24 hours to turn things around. And in the end, I was really disappointed with the cloth bound because there were errors that I had actually corrected in galleys, but they weren't corrected somehow when the book came out. So the paperback is which comes out, it came out like a year later, has almost all the corrections that I wish would have been made in the cloth bound issue, and that has everything to do with timing. They said we want the book out by Monk's birthday, and these are commercial issues. These are not intellectual issues or issues about veracity.
Right.
I gave my publisher a deadline. I was with University of Chicago Press, and it refused. It absolutely refused to tell me in what year. I didn't want a month. I wanted the year that the book would be released. They wouldn't tell me. So I gave them an ultimatum. I said, either you tell me by this date or I'm gone. The date came and went. I walked. And I did the ebook all myself. I mean, I had somebody make the code for the language. But now I'm putting out a paperback, and yeah, Robin, I'm finding mistakes. Of course, they're mistakes that I made. But having the luxury of doing the ebook first has enabled me to take my time with the paperback, in part because I have to do an index. With the ebook, of course, you can do your own searches. I know Howard didn't like that. A lot of people who read the ebook said it's frustrating to click on the end note and to get taken to the end notes in the back, the citations. But I'm working on the index, and in so doing, I'm finding more mistakes. So the paperback I'll be very pleased with, and that's on my schedule 12, 13 years later. But I had a publisher who just wouldn't cooperate at all, so I left.
Well,
Can I get back to that?
Go ahead.
I was just can I get back to that family question again?
Okay.
I just wanted to emphasize how important family is when you're writing about somebody, because I mean, you're lucky if they want you to tell the truth, because most families don't. Most families want to keep certain things hidden. And I ran into things, not so much like that, but with Marion and her husband, Jimmy McPartland, never had children, but Jimmy had been married in the 1930s before he met Marion, and he had a daughter who had two children. And those children became very close with Marion, and they became invaluable sources for me. They were really friendly. One is a drummer named Doug Castle in Berkeley. He lives in Alameda, actually, who is kind of a collector, and so he'd done a whole lot of collecting on the internet and various places about his grandfather, Jimmy, and had this vast archive. And he was a saver and a hoarder of things, too, so he's the one who shared all these letters and this correspondence that he'd had with Marion. And this was invaluable in painting a picture of a person, not just a pianist, not just somebody, how do you deal with your sideman, what does your drummer say about you, but what does your step-grandson say about you, and what's happened over the years between you and him, and between you and your step-granddaughter. And as it developed for me, that became a really fertile area in which to paint a picture of Marion as a person. It also inevitably produced tensions. And when the final manuscript of the book came out, I have to say there was certain amount of unhappiness about things that were in the book about these kids. They're no longer kids; they're over 50 now. So I think family is really important and really volatile.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how do you balance writing memoirs like this, and also I read all three books pretty much as novels. I mean, Paul, yours is very novelistic from the opening. Sort of the sweeping love story set in World War II. And although, Robin, I find yours, has the historical perspective, still it could be an epic kind of novel. And I thought the Bud Powell almost worked like a noir, actually, Peter.
Okay.
I mean, because you were very close to to Bud, and like over his shoulder all the time, and he's going through the mental hospital, or he's dealing, with his strangeness in Birdland or something. I mean, are you concerned that you're getting too novelistic or cinematic in your approaches, that will somehow devalue the biographies as, or are you, thinking about the reader there? You want to carry the reader along?
Very good question. I tried very hard to deal with this question on my own. For me, the question was, how much of my time am I advancing the narrative, that is, relating events as, having the reader see the story unfold, and how often or how much of my text do I arrest the narrative in order to do some analysis? In other words, saying, dear reader, the reason I've taken you to this place, that place, and the other place is I want to show you something. Or something happens and I feel there's some, not exposition necessary, but some explication. I need to do some analysis of what happened. And I couldn't do it myself. I mean, that's why you're supposed to have an editor who reads your work at a publisher. And I asked colleagues and I asked friends who have nothing to do with jazz. And I asked everyone the same question. How do you find the balance in my writing between the narrative proper, the advancing of the story, and analysis? And I got some feedback, but if I had to say, I wish somebody had done more of it. But obviously, everybody's got his own life to live, and nobody wanted to live Bud Powell's life with me, at least not as much as I was living it. I could have used more of that. I could have used someone to say, enough analysis, get back to the story. Or, boy, you've given us so much exposition here. You've got to stop and explain what's going on internally or, to your way of thinking.
Yeah, no, that's a really great answer. I mean, my target audience was the the general reader, the reader who may not know as much about the music. Mm-hmm. So a lot of my musical analysis I actually took out. I ended up taking out about 120 pages from the book as a consequence of both my editor's pressure, but also my pressure on myself to sort of tell a story. The other thing, though, to be fair, is that Monk was a fantastic storyteller, and his life kind of for me at least, lends itself to a kind of narrative form because it really was a struggle to make it, a struggle for recognition, a struggle to make a living, a struggle to keep his family together. I mean, everything was a struggle. And the thing about the way the book was structured, and again, the structure came out of the writing. I didn't outline the whole book ahead of time. The outline that I had to throw out. That at the end of each chapter, you're sort of left on a precipice, and that precipice sort of was his life. I mean, there was a moment where something terrible would happen, and you have to find out what happens next. And so that's the story that I found that's the story I found from the material, as opposed to the story that I imposed on Monk himself.
I think the question about whether a biography is like a novel goes right to the heart of what the form is. Life, as we live it, has no story. It's just a bunch of random things that happen. And so if you tell that story, nobody will read it. It isn't a story. It's just a bunch of things that happen. So you can't tell the story of somebody's life without creating a narrative yourself. Now, if you're trying to be honest, you're going to base it on what actually happened, but this is a process of choice. If you write the story, you're going to choose what you think is interesting and what's important, and you're going to construct narrative according to subjects that you think are important. So none of these books is true to the extent that people want some kind of absolute truth. They're just a choice of how to tell a story. So I take a novelistic approach on purpose because I don't see how you can tell the story any other way. A biography is like a novel based on fact.
That's great, Paul. It would be interesting to hear something about how your publishers looked at your works. Do they want jazz biographies? I know, Peter, you had difficult situations with your publishers. Was the sell that you had to make, Robin? How, what was the eagerness or the reluctance?
Who goes first?
You do. You
Well,
just spoke up.
I had some eagerness because I was lucky enough that my agent found a fan of Marion who happened to be an editor at St. Martin. He wasn't interested in jazz. He was interested in Marion. So that's long and short of it there.
Right. In my particular case, I happened to, I was already under contract with the Free Press for another book, which is about the history of the black urban poor. And my editor, and I'd gotten really sick for some reason, and then I was in the hospital, and I had this kind of epiphany that that's not the book I wanted to write. I wanted to write about Monk. And my editor just happened to be, his name is Bruce Nichols, he's no longer at the Free Press, a wonderful trombone player who loves this music. And when I told him I wanted to write a book about Monk, he leaped on it, you know. He says, I know that there's some other books in the making, but let's see what we can do. And so I had full, complete support to write the book I wanted to write from the get-go, and I really appreciated that.
Well, you're a lucky guy.
Mm-hmm.
Can it work the other way, though, guys, that you have someone who says from the get-go, gee, I love jazz. I'm so excited for you to be doing this book because this fulfills, you know, it's my passion, and I can't wait. But then, because he thinks he loves jazz, or he really does, or she, there are expectations. And those expectations, sooner or later, rub up against your designs. I guess from my experience at both publishers, Farrar Straus and University of Chicago, I had editors who said they loved jazz, they loved Bud Powell's music, and they were thrilled to have, but between their negligence on the one hand and certain expectations they had, I wound up feeling I'd rather have had an editor who didn't know anything about jazz. In fact, the point made earlier about your writing for the non-jazz specialist, I think, is critically important. Because then you don't use a lot of jargon. You don't try to settle disputes you have with your colleagues. You know, some critic who has always rubbed you the wrong way. Now you got a book, so you can stick it to him or her. You don't have the barriers because the person is just an intelligent reader, an editor, but doesn't come to this with some baggage about what a jazz book should be. In my experience, I wished I'd had a complete novice, a good reader, but a complete jazz novice.
Right. But I would guess that a good editor should be able to figure out who the audience is and then edit accordingly, no matter what their area of expertise.
I think that's true. I don't think, oddly enough, I don't think publishers are dying to publish jazz biographies,
Right.
but we're living in a golden age of jazz biography, so somebody must want to publish them.
Right.
Well, it's the editor at the publishing company, and if it's a large enough company, there's bound to be somebody who once tried to be a musician or is a collector or hangs out at clubs. I mean, I think that's, you know, jazz in New York anyway. Every fourth person has some knowledge or interest. It's, as Monk said, it's in the air, you know. And all I'm saying is I'd rather get not that 1 in 4 at the publisher, but one of the other 3 who doesn't know, but is just a good reader. If I'd had that, I might have published with one of these 2.
Can I ask if you guys have any sales figures on the books? I know it's too early, Paul, for you to know anything. But Robin, your book has been out for 3 years. Can you give us a round table?
Yeah, I think, I could be wrong about this, but I think from the last statement, in cloth, it sold about 35,000 copies.
35,000. That's wonderful.
Yeah, in cloth. And then
wonderful.
In paper, the paper sold so far about 10,000.
Excellent.
And so it's still selling. And in the Kindle, I don't really know what the numbers are there, but you know, it's funny. You know, the way the industry works, because of Amazon and because of the discounted book, it makes more sense to get a cloth copy because the cloth price was almost the same as the paperback. So you know, that's partly why the cloth sold so well. But I can't complain. You know, my current wife and my ex-wife are very happy about that.
Do you have any movie nibbles yet?
Oh, that's another story. There's been some interest, but that's a very hard thing to do. I don't expect anything, but there's been some interest by particular actors.
Those are really, really good numbers. I mean, most jazz books are about 2,000 to 5,000 copies.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Oh, I can't complain. Yeah, well, it's okay.
But most
Peter,
of them
what's your
aren't
experience?
good and really about Monk either.
What's your experience so far?
I'm sorry? Well, the
Your
paperback
experience so far?
The paperback will be out in October. I'm doing it myself. The ebook has been slow. I'm on my own in terms of promotion and marketing and all that. I've got a website. I think people have been able to see a little bit of it during this chat. I've sold a few hundred in ebook. I'm hoping for a little better response to the ebook when the paperback is out for those who prefer ebook. But obviously, I'm going to paperback because I have not been able to get a lot of reviews. I've been frustrated by that. I think jazz reviewers, at least in print media, are older, if not as quite as old as I, but they're older, and they're not accustomed to the new technology. I don't blame them. So I decided to go to paper and get copies out to the reviewers in the major media, and I'm doing an initial run of 2,000. Now, it's my dollar, so I found a printer that'll do a good job for me at a very good price, and I can't fit more than 2,000 in my apartment. But I think I agree with Paul that the numbers I hear for 2,000 to 5,000 is about, for jazz book, that's about what they usually are. So I figure I'll print 2,000. I hope I can sell them out. I can always go back and print 2,000 more. But my royalty rate, since I'm doing it myself, if anybody's interested, will be 5 times what it would be if I published with a publisher. I mean, without getting into the exact numbers, if I publish this book with a publisher, I'd make, well, $2.40 per book. If I publish it myself, print it myself, I'll make 5 times that. Mm-hmm. So I only have to sell 1/5 on my own that I would sell through a publisher. That's how I've looked at it.
Do you, especially considering the possibilities of working online, do you think about publishing in the future things that you had to leave out, like, Robin, your 140 pages of music links? Could that be an appendix that you could put on Kindle? Or, you know, would that also be a way of promoting the book and having it have longer lifespan to keep adding chapters or, you know, further discussion or something like that?
Well, what I did was I have a website, www.monkbook.com, and on that website I have a lot of the excerpts that have been cut out from the book are posted, and the one thing I did not put in the book was a sessionography. You know, so there's a real detailed, very long sessionography that basically has all of Monk's, you know, recording sessions and things. And it's a whole lot of material that just did not make the book that's on that website. You know.
Peter, your whole discussion of the cabaret card is, you know, something that I think you could excerpt and publish independently.
Thank you. That's a good idea. And Robin is encouraging me. I have put up a website, since Robin mentioned his address. I'm www.budpowellbio, that's budpowellbio.com. And I have some things there, but I haven't thought about what I think are, Robin would agree, are outtakes, stuff from that didn't make it to the final pressing, so to speak. And I'm encouraged by what he said to consider it. And maybe that appendix, which is a history of the so-called, it was cabaret card, not what it was called, and it's not its real name, but that's what everybody referred to it as. And I do a history in legalese. Mm-hmm. It's got all the legal citations going back to the year 1900 to see the history of it in New York. And I could put that online or publish it separately if there's a law school that would be interested. I have directed NYU Law School to it. They helped with some of the research. So, yeah, I mean, I'm still building my website. Once the paperback is out, I'll go back to the site and think, with this encouragement from this talk, to put some outtakes and other material that I have that didn't make it into the book online. It's a perfect medium for it.
Well, what about you in this regard? Have you begun to work out your publicity and promotion campaign?
I'm dead center in the middle of it. I'm starting up readings here and radio appearances here in Seattle. Then I come to New York October 22nd. And then I go up to Rochester, which was Marion's kind of second home, do some things there, go down to South Carolina where her show originates, in Washington, D.C., down to San Francisco. Yeah, I'm in the middle of the whole promotion phase.
Mm-hmm. I've got a couple very specific questions and one kind of interesting general one, and we are running out of time. So briefly, what are your thoughts about fan funding like ArtistShare or Kickstarter for projects like this? Briefly.
I think it's great. I think the person to ask about that is Dan Willett. He did it for his biography of Ron Carter, and I think it worked out for him.
I'm not sure how well it worked out, but there's an idea. The other question, this is kind of the general question, we can't spend too much time on it at this point. How much musicians' vision and creativity shaped and were shaped by the society is a crucial question, says Masayoshi Yamada. My question for the panelists would be, how do you strike a balance between structure and agency? This is kind of a conceptual question, but I think you know what she means.
Well,
I think we've been
Like
talking
how much
about,
did you think? Oh,
I think we've been talking about that. You know, what social forces, I mean, we don't choose when we're born, right? Marion McPartland was born in 1918 at the end, before World War I was ended, and grew up between the time of the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II in England, which completely screwed. I mean, that determined a lot of who she was. What jazz was available determined who she was. The fact she was a woman determined who she was. I mean, I talk at one point of compare her to George Shearing. I mean, George, as a teenager, is going down and jamming with Fats Waller. Marion would no sooner think of going down to a Soho nightclub than shoot herself when she was a teenager. It just wasn't done. She was a middle-class woman from a suburb. So, yeah, I mean, all those things, you have to talk about the social forces and the historical times that people grow up in and prosper or not don't prosper in. And indeed, imbalance of agency. What did they do about that? Did they just give in? Did they hate it? Did they roll with it? I mean, Marion, for example, really was not a feminist. But when feminism hit the fore, you can bet she got out there and got out in front.
Does this question make us reflect, you know, in the process of writing these bios, on our own lives, how much agency we have, or how much, you know, our lives are dictated by circumstance and our response to those circumstances?
Well,
you personalize the experience of writing biographies that way?
Well, let me can I weigh in on this question? Because in terms of thinking about both the project of writing this book and also how structure and agency operated with regard to Monk, I had to have a sea change in terms of my thinking, and I ended up putting a lot less stress on social forces in terms of understanding creativity. Because, for example, for someone like Monk, bipolar disorder, depression, manic depression, whatever you call it, people put a lot of stock in that as a motive, as a kind of social force, or, you know, a kind of source of genius, and I kind of reject that idea. When in fact, if anything, I discovered by studying his life and his world very carefully that it became much more of a hindrance and a fetter than anything else. And the same thing when you talk about things like, you know, if you sort of tell a story where bebop and World War II and wartime forces become the motive for creativity, then we miss the fact that someone like Thelonious Monk spent as much time at James P. Johnson's house playing stride piano at the same time he's going to Minton's Playhouse and dealing with so-called bebop revolution. And so when you follow people in their footsteps and you try to figure out where does the creative drive come from, sometimes it comes directly from, I don't want to say within, but from a relationship between the world that they're living in and the mistakes, the errors, the chance encounters, the things that are totally unexpected that produce new sounds, whether it's trying to reproduce the sound of trains passing by or the sound of birds. That these are the things that I think as scholars, as writers, biographers, we have to really pay attention to.
Well said, Robin. I would like to end it there, but I've got one more question, which Peter's going to be on the spot for, and I know he's not going to like it, but I'll ask it anyway. Will you talk about, Peter, why you replaced Afro-American and Caucasian with the terms Aframs and Urams?
All right.
This question says people found this offensive because Bud's life took place in a time defined by racism and racial strife. Do you have a short answer
well,
to that?
It's all in the preface, and if you just read the preface carefully, you can accept or reject my value. But I believe that language needs to be prescriptive as well as descriptive. And I believe that the day must come when we get away from labels. I reject the label of black and white because everybody has a color. No two people are the same color. And as I say in my preface, if you lined up every musician in the world, or think of Great Day in Harlem, the photo, and you lined them up from the lightest skin to the darkest skin, you could not draw a line and say everyone to the left of the line is white and everyone to the right of the line is black. It would be arbitrary. I consider these terms to be terms used by the police and other social institutions in order to separate people, to divide them, and to make clear delineations along stark lines. You're either black or you're white. And I think that looking forward, we must get past these labels and think of people as people. People can self-define. Anyone is free to self-define with a color or a label or anything. But I believe these are artificial, and since I wrote the book, I define in my own way. I use African American and European American because they are geographic distinctions. And I say in the preface, there are people who do not fit neatly into those categories. People who have both, I mean, we're all from Ethiopia. So there are people who are both European and African descent, of those two descents, and there are some from Asian descent as well. Even some of them fit in the story. So I found African American and European American less distasteful than black and white. I use the shorthand as a neologism. I don't like neologisms, and that's in my preface. I say I wish I didn't have to do it, but I am trying to get away from labels that only divide us and that frankly do no good. They have been used on us to label us, police to identify perpetrators, and I think since it's my book, I want to get away from that.
Okay. Paul, one last word from you, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. Anything that's on your mind from the discussion?
No, I was just ready to say that I'm really glad I got to listen as well as talk.
You hear?
Well, thanks. Thanks for the participation of all three of you tonight. Robin Kelly, Paul DeBarros, Peter Pullman. The next JJA webinar is going to be Wednesday, October 17th. We'll be talking to three of the younger jazz bloggers. We're going to announce who those guests are. See it on jjnews.org and the JJ's Facebook page. Please like and share our Facebook page so more people know about these webinars. Please join the Jazz Journalists Association. I want to thank also Joanne Kaywell, who's been behind the scenes organizing the webinar. She did a great job, and really it's a lot of work to do. You don't know. Joanne is going to be preparing a 3-part workshop on blogging, which we will announce. This will be free to JJA members, but it will require a fee from non-members, which is another reason to join the JJA, which you can do by going to jjnews.org, clicking join, follow the simple instructions. So, okay, that's it for tonight. This webinar will be archived for free access at YouTube, along with the other JJA webinars, including our entire 15-webinar iJazz video training program. I'm Howard Mandel. I'm president of the Jazz Journalists Association. Again, thank you, Robin, Paul, and Peter. Good night to everybody.
Thank you, Howard.
My pleasure.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Howard.
It was fun. Thank you.